Hello, I'm Sanjucta, and I'm part of the web experience team here at WP Engine, which is basically the team that's responsible for WP Engine's websites. And today I'll be talking with a group of experts about the new Core Web Vital metric that Google has introduced. It's called Interaction to Next Paint, and it's due to replace first input delay very soon this year. So we'll start off with a round of introductions. So Ivailo, do you want to go first?
Hi everyone. So my name is Ivailo and I'm part of the NitroPack team where we've been doing a lot of site speed optimization and recently dealing with optimizing for INP. Very excited to be here, guys.
Great, thank you. I'll move on to Scott then, next.
Sure. I'm Scott Stamile. I'm a senior solution strategist at Wpromote. I have about 15 years of experience in design, development, and web architecture. We do a lot of WordPress builds here, and more recently we've been focusing a lot on headless and WP Engine's Atlas. Yeah, excited to be here and talk to you guys.
Great. Adam, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yep, sorry, it might be a network issue, but I am back. My name's Adam Silverstein. I'm a developer relations engineer at Google. I work on the Chrome team, on the web platform team, and focused on Core Web Vitals on the web through the lens of content management systems and primarily WordPress.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Really happy to have you all here today. So I'll just get started with the first question, a very basic question. So what is INP and how is it different from first input delay? So maybe Adam can kick us off for that.
Sure. INP is the new metric for measuring interactivity. It's part of the Core Web Vitals. I think the big difference, there's a couple differences between it and the metric that it replaces, first input delay. The first one being that, as the name suggests, first input delay only measures the first interaction on the page, whereas the new metric INP actually measures all of the interactions over the life cycle of the page and then reports on the worst one. The other big difference is that INP only measures the very small amount of time that it takes between the interaction when the user does something like a mouse click and when the event handlers for that event fire, so that initial delay. Whereas first input delay actually measures the entire cycle of the interaction from the click to when some visual representation from the browser is available to show the user that the browser is responding.
Right. So Ivailo, what is your take on INP? What do you understand it to be?
Yeah, like Adam said, it's like these are the core differences between it and FID. And I think that the important thing here to take away is that with INP, we are now measuring interactions throughout the life cycle of a web page. So it's not the first one, right? Which is very important and it's something that we have to think about, and it gives us also a lot more insight on how users are experiencing our website, because due to different reasons, the first interaction can be really quick, and the way FID was structured to work was something that wasn't really useful in what it was trying to measure and the information it was trying to give us, right? So with INP, we are now able to more accurately measure the interaction delays and how our users perceive our application and our website, right?
Okay, so essentially what I hear you saying is that it's a better measure of interactiveness, right?
Yeah, and the nice thing about it is that inherently, I think it pushes towards providing more visual feedback to the users in a timely manner that something is happening. Because previously, if you just measure technically how much time it takes for something to run after you click, that you might measure that, but you don't kind of incentivize any visual feedback on the application, right? Where with INP, it's nice that it kind of makes you think that you have to when you interact with the site, you have to have some sort of visual feedback and paint something on the screen to make sure and to provide feedback to the user that something has happened. Their action was taken into account, the work is done, or the work is being currently done, it's working in the background, things like that.
Great.
Yep.
So kind of that brings me to my next question, and this one is for Scott. So what do you think is the business impact of the introduction of this new metric? Like, do you think that there are any business KPIs that would be affected by it?
Yeah, I think this is a really useful metric to have. It's an interesting one because traditionally Core Web Vitals focuses on initial page load. That's what pretty much all of the metrics look at. This is really one of the first metrics that is looking at the overall user experience of a user visiting your site. It's looking at that from an interactive standpoint. So from the moment a user interacts throughout the entire sort of lifespan of them visiting a specific page, it's measuring from the moment they interact. So say they click on something, that input lag followed by some processing, and then the next time that the main thread is freed up. And traditionally, that's something that matters from a user experience standpoint, but it's been difficult for us to tie that to something that matters from a business standpoint more specifically. So yeah, what I think is really interesting about this new Core Web Vital is that it's one of the first that focuses on the overall user experience. Traditionally, we've had difficulty tying user experience, which obviously matters to actual customers and to businesses, but tying that to something that we can actually look at as a metric that matters from a search ranking perspective. This metric does that for us. It allows us to concern ourselves with user experience, tie that to SEO potentially, and that connection gives us more sort of authoritative reason to pay attention to the actual on-page user experience of our customers.
Yeah, so essentially what you're saying, I think, is that since it's a more total measure of user interactiveness, so businesses are going to be more incentivized to optimize their sites for Core Web Vitals.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks for that. So which brings me to my next question, and since we're a WordPress hosting company, so how does this impact WordPress like sites? How does INP impact WordPress sites? And could you explain, like, potentially with the help of some real world scenarios, how the introduction of this new metric is going to affect WordPress sites? Adam, would you like to take that?
Sure, I'll take it. I think I just want to say, to back up just a second, that I think we all know that there are poor experiences out on the web. We've all browsed around on the web and tried to click on something and had it not respond to us. So we know that the web is not great. There are certain sites, there's certain experiences that just are poor. And what this new metric does is help us actually capture or find those poor interactions that we didn't have before. In terms of WordPress sites, what we see in the data is that WordPress sites actually struggle more with this metric than they did with the previous metric. So because INP is measuring more interactions, it's more extensive what it's measuring, it actually succeeds in finding these poor interactions where our previous metric FID was failing. So I think the impact for WordPress users is, for some sites, they're going to actually see a negative impact on their CWV scores, which sounds bad. But the good part that I want to, shift to is that this actually is showing you where you have poor interactions. These are already poor interactions that your users are already having. And what this new metric is going to do is help you find those poor interactions and hopefully fix them. And just to tie that back to business metrics, when people have poor experiences on your site, many studies have shown that leads to poor business results. So, this metric is aimed to help you as a site owner. And in WordPress, that means, being more attentive to what you're doing on your site, what third-party scripts you're putting on the site, how much you've loaded up there, the same types of things we've always paid attention to with performance, but this is going to be a new insight into where things might be going wrong.
Okay, so essentially you're saying the problems that existed already exist, but this new metric is going to help surface them so that site owners and developers can fix them, right?
Exactly.
Great, great. Ivailo, like, what would be your take on this? Like, since
Yeah,
you were
it's somewhat what Adam already mentioned, and I was thinking of an example because all of us have had this experience of, for example, you load up an e-commerce site and you want to purchase something, right? And you click the add to cart button, nothing happens. You try to click the cart button, nothing happens. And what do you do at that point? You typically just navigate away from the website and look up another one that's going to provide the product that you're looking for and browse there. So if we have to tie it with the business impact, we can very easily see how not having a responsive website can negatively impact our business, right? And as Adam mentioned, this is already, there are a lot of studies showing this. And with this metric now that we have a standardized way to kind of measure when these bad interactions are happening, so we can eliminate those cases and put our site in the best kind of position to provide good service to our users and to capture our visitors, turn them into buyers and things like that. So the metric essentially is going to surface and to provide us a view of when these bad interactions are happening and give us a measurable way to know whether we are improving or making things worse when we are doing changes to our website.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Then I'm coming to a question which is, of course, going to be of great interest to a vast majority of our audiences who come from the development space. So what can developers do to optimize their sites for INP? And specifically, since it's a measure of interactiveness, so how would that affect how developers write JavaScript?
Yeah. Maybe I can take it here a little bit, because what we've seen is, as an impact, is the fact that sites nowadays typically have a lot of third parties, right? And most of those third parties integrate into our websites with additional JavaScript. So developers should start thinking more of the fact that they're not the only ones running on the website, and the code that we produce is going to run alongside the code of another service. And we should think of how we play together and play nicely with our solutions on the website. So let's say we have a click handler for a button, or we're processing some user. Those things are code that's running while the user is doing it. It needs to be complete its job in a fast manner, right? So the user can see the feedback from what they're doing while they're, for example, typing in the field. But what if we have 3 other tools that also hook into this input field and process the input? All of these things need to play nicely together, and we need to be mindful of the fact that other services might be doing also work on this thing, and make sure that our code is like as efficient as possible. If we have some long processing that we need to do, make it in an off thread, or if it's not critical to be the processing to happen immediately, just put it in a queue, do it when the browser is in an idle state or things like that.
Right.
So, yeah, I think we should be mindful that we're not the only ones on the website.
Yeah, I could build on that a little bit. Like, I think that's a really critical point, that when you have poor interactions, it might not be because of anything that you've done on your site, but rather it could just be other JavaScript that's running on your site. I would say if you're a developer and you're writing the JavaScript handlers, one really important point is yielding back to the main thread. So this just means that as soon as your event handler starts firing, you want to immediately do like a set timeout 0, and then your callback to handle the event. And that lets the main thread get to the display of whatever the update is that you're trying to display more quickly. And then the second big thing for developers is pay attention to DOM and CSS complexity. That's another point where with low power devices, when the browser is trying to display that update, if you have an incredibly complex DOM, thousands of nested objects, or incredibly complex CSS, it can take quite a while for the device to actually respond. So those 2 points are ones that developers can pay attention to building sites, but the reality is you're also going to need to pay attention to what other services and scripts you're putting on your page.
That's actually a great point, Adam, because since we've been looking at a lot of data recently for INP, we've noticed that specifically on mobile, for example, a lot of devices that struggle with INP are low-power devices. Like they have either 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory. So if you have like a large DOM or a complex CSS, it just puts a lot more strain to the device, and the device might not be able to just handle everything that's happening in a quick manner, right? So that's, I think, a very good point.
Right, and I think we also tend to add a lot of external third-party JavaScript for things like tracking and analytics and that kind of thing. So, Scott, what would your view be on that? Like,
Sure.
how do you think that would affect this metric?
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately this metric is looking at sort of 3 things from the point of interaction. It's looking at something called input latency, which is like from the point that you click on an item on an element to when it's able to start processing JavaScript, the processing time itself, and then the final rendering. The issues that you can happen at any point in that space. And as Adam suggested, we ideally want to yield back to the main thread as soon as possible. So some of the things that we can do as developers to help move things along more quickly is to break up those longer tasks. If you have a long task that potentially is making additional network requests after the interaction, or it's doing any number of other things, it's obviously going to vary on a case-by-case basis, but break that up so that you can free up that main thread, maybe provide some visual feedback ideally to the user that they've interacted. That is ultimately what you're looking at. I mean, if you think about the term itself, the actual like the terminology, interaction to next paint, it's not interaction to final paint. The goal is to get back to a point where the browser can start rendering again and free up that main thread. And I think to your point on additional events, one of the things that can sort of get in there and gum things up is if you have events tied to interactions that need to process those events, maybe they're being added through GTM, for example. They may not even be in your actual like code base. Trying to move those into something that doesn't block that main thread, have it run after the fact. So you interact, it then performs some visual feedback on the site, and then continues to process asynchronously after the fact. And recording tracking events is one of those things that you can potentially do that with.
Great. Yeah, that's a great point I think you've made. So I think the point all of you are making is to break up your JavaScript, keep the main thread free as much as possible. And when it comes to things like tracking, do it after the fact, or after providing some sort of feedback to the user. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep.
Okay, and you all of you have touched upon this a lot, but I still wanted to bring it up. So are there any special precautions that you need to take when you're optimizing for mobile?
I think mainly it's the fact that the mobile space is, those devices tend to be a lot less powerful than a desktop, and we typically develop the websites on desktop. And even though we simulate devices, these simulations are still simulations and do not reflect the real world and how people will be experiencing the website. So it's it also depends on the audience, because what we've seen is that depending on your audience, you might be, for example, having issues or not having issues with INP responsiveness just because the majority of your user base is, for example, using high-powered devices, or they happen to use lower-end devices. It's always a safe bet to make your site work smoothly in a low-powered scenario. But for mobile, I think one of the things that is very nice to do is to just test. If you can test on a really in the real world with a low-powered device, that's the best thing you can do. Or just there are different services that provide these kinds of real devices for testing purposes that you can just use online and use it remotely. These greatly also help in the debugging process, making sure that your website performs well there.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, ultimately this is a metric that is shared across desktop and mobile. It's the same metric. So the difference that you're looking at for mobile are the things that tend to be more prevalent on mobile. So lower performance devices, the network issues are more likely to occur on mobile devices than on desktops or laptops, obviously. One other interesting thing I'll point out that's sort of worth keeping in mind when troubleshooting these issues is that from what I'm aware, Safari, so there's the actual way that this works is that the browser itself is using something called an event timing API that reports this data. It records the data and then reports it back to Google's Core Web Vitals. Safari doesn't support this API. And so what that means is that some of the most powerful mobile devices aren't actually feeding data into this. It's worth just keeping that in mind. It's not necessarily to say that you shouldn't care about Safari and mobile Safari, but that that the metric doesn't necessarily reflect that device. Yeah.
So Adam, does Google have a way of is Google thinking of correcting this problem? Because from what I understand, from what Scott says, we're not receiving the data from a section of the web, so to speak. So
I don't think we have a specific strategy. I think it's an open API. It's up to Safari to adopt it if they want to support that API that Scott was talking about. I will say that despite the prevalence of iPhones in the US and Western countries, by and large, the vast majority of people are actually on Android devices. So it is really important to pay attention to those devices. I think your question about mobile actually points to one important factor about INP, which is that it's very difficult to test and debug in the lab on your own computer. It's very difficult to even know where to start. To recognize that you have these INP problems, usually you want to start with field data or real user metrics. This is where you're going to see the problems emerge because you're going to see actual users with those low power devices in poor network conditions. And it might not just be that their device is low power, but it might be busy doing other things. It might have apps running in the background. So it can be very difficult to simulate those in the browser, even with dev tools and throttling and all that stuff, because you don't know where to even test. But as soon as you start to have real user metrics for your site, which you can collect yourself or use a third-party provider, but once you have that data and you have captured where those interactions are, then you have something to actually work on debugging in your browser, in your local where you can actually reproduce it. And I will say also that in the field data that we see, desktop computers pretty much pass this metric almost always. Even with the new metric, it's still very high percentage of devices, of users that have a good experience because desktop devices tend to be more powerful, is what it boils down to. But that's not everyone. So I think the important thing with mobile and this metric is that's where the problems are. That's where you need to pay attention to, and you need to get some sort of field data to help you identify where the actual problems are.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that this is now going to be a better measure of interactiveness, and which is going to surface problems which we hadn't realized were there before. And the best way to kind of utilize this information is to kind of collect real user metrics from the user, so that we know where the problem, that we know that there is a section of visitors that are facing this problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the way that we've sort of approached this from a process standpoint is that we'll look at that data from, say, Google, Google Search Console. Sorry, I was blanking on it there, which is going to give you a report of your different pages. That helps us that sort of provides us with that user data. Once we have that, we can start looking at the actual pages and the interactions themselves. You can sort of inventory them potentially. And Chrome specifically has some really nice tools in that performance tab in developer tools that allow you to actually like record interactions, drill down into them, and start to understand where the issues may lie. That process right there is really useful in sort of identifying these issues and helping you diagnose and hopefully address them.
Great. Yeah, that's a great point out. So yeah, which kind of brings me to my next question. So how does this metric impact headless sites? So we see there's a move towards headless, and so is there anything special in the way that it affects headless sites? Maybe Adam, you want to take that?
Yeah. Sure. So as we said before, this metric measures the entire life cycle of a page. And when you're talking about headless sites, you're, I think, talking about sites that have soft navigations where you navigate from page to page, but it's actually not a full refresh. It's not a hard refresh in the typical sense of a web browser making a new request to the web server. It's what we call a soft navigation, where maybe you change the URL, but it's really you're on the same page. Nothing new, not a new page has loaded, just the display has refreshed. And these so-called soft navigations are not actually captured currently by the metric. So what you're going to see is that it's going to measure all the interactions over several pages of interactions if the user visits several pages. This has a couple consequences. One is that if your, say, home page has different performance characteristics than a subpage, you're going to blend those together. You're not really measuring that second page that the user visits. The second is that because of the fact that we discard outliers in interactions, you may actually benefit from having more interactions in your pool. It's something like 1 in 50, I think, is the number of sort of outlier interactions that are discarded. But by and large, I would say these metrics, all the Core Web Vitals metrics, are not really designed for these new types of single-page app sites, headless single-page app sites. But we are looking into ways to improve it. There is an experiment right now that will support soft navigations and essentially try to segment those pages into being separate pages. So you can check that out. If you search for like soft navigation INP, you'll probably find the ticket. So I would say right now it doesn't really do a good job of measuring those experiences because it's really going to treat it as a single page.
Yeah, one of the good things about headless sites does tend to be that page-to-page experience does tend to be faster than a full reload. So it's sort of challenging because on the one hand, that experience is improved from reloading page to page to page. On the other hand, it's now being included in that metric, which potentially gives you I would argue, an incorrect reading on the INP metric.
Yeah. I was just going to add to that, Scott. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry.
That actual navigation from page to page can often be the slowest part of a single page app, and often INP actually captures that interaction as your core interaction of navigating.
Okay. And also for these headless based websites, one thing that I've kind of seen is that a lot of the times you have a heavier front-end part, so you have a lot more JavaScript. You typically run a framework that's going to build your UI, and you're going to be fetching data from the backend and filling the gaps and then showing the application. But what all of this means is that all of the heavy processing is now done on the device, and you run a lot more JavaScript. So your budget for additional services, for example, if you want to add something through GTM, now shrinks, because your framework has to run, your entire website has to handle the navigations, the state, and everything. And this is just a lot of just added overhead and things that you need to take care of while you're building your app and make sure that they work in an efficient manner. Whereas if you're using a traditional website and traditional page-to-page navigations, you have a lot of stuff rendered on the server, then you ship your HTML, then more efficient code is parsing this HTML and then rendering the page in a more efficient way than if you're trying to parse this in JavaScript and then decide what to put in the page, manipulate the DOM and things like that. Just something to pay attention to when building these applications.
Yeah, one of the things to keep in mind with these headless sites is, and this is something we had to address for FID as well, and some of the other metrics that we were already looking at, as well as just general like search indexing. The sort of trend lately has been to do more server-side rendering with headless sites. So that means, going back to not necessarily a traditional approach, but what the browser ends up receiving isn't just a bunch of JavaScript that it necessarily has to run. Doing that is a huge help, both for traditional like search indexing, but it's also going to help you here in freeing up that JavaScript's ability to execute more quickly. One of the other things that are worth looking at here, if you are working on a headless site, is that there are features of frameworks that have been added to help address this. React 18, for example, added selective hydration and start transition features that allow you to prioritize interruptions of JavaScript execution, and among other things, to help free up the main thread more readily. Doing that again, like even the page-to-page navigation issue, as long as you free up the main thread and can potentially render something on the screen, that it's not necessary, you can sort of bypass that network request of pulling in the new content for the subsequent page. So there are ways to address this even on a headless site.
Oh yeah. That was a great call out, Scott. Thank you for that. So I think that was a great discussion. I think we have kind of an idea of what this new metric is and what we need to do as site owners and developers to kind of stay ahead of the curve, or at least not be really very surprised when Google actually phases out FID in favor of INP. So thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate it.